Well, hi, everybody, and thank you all so much for joining us this evening. My name is Amy, as many as you know, and I'm the museum coordinator at the North Lanark Regional Museum. We are very happy to present a digital speaker series, and while this event has no ticket cost, we do encourage you to make a donation to the North Lanark Historical Society. We are a not-for-profit organization that is dedicated to the collection, preservation, and presentation of local history, and your donations help to ensure that we can continue to offer these fantastic events. The link to our donation page will be put in the chat box of this meeting. We ask that you keep your microphones muted to limit any background noise, but you are welcome to leave your cameras on if you'd like. This presentation is being recorded, and the video will be used for promotional and educational purposes by the Historical Society and will be posted on our public YouTube page. At the end of our presentation, you're welcome to unmute your microphones and ask any questions you have to our speaker, or you can type your questions into the chat box. I'm now very happy to introduce our speaker for this evening. Jim Brownell is the president of the Lost Villages Historical Society, a group of dedicated individuals who support the development of educational and museum archiving programs at the Lost Villages Museum in Long Sault, Ontario. One of the main goals of the Society is to inform the public about the loss of communities which formerly existed along the St. Lawrence River prior to the building of the St. Lawrence Seaway in the late 1950s. Jim is a retired teacher and spent 22 years of his life in municipal and provincial politics and was the MPP for Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry from 2003 to 2011. Please join me in welcoming Jim and thanking him for presenting for us today.
Thank you, Amy, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I bring greetings to you from the members and the executive of the Lost Villages Historical Society. And as Amy said, I am the president, and there has been longevity in our executive positions because I've been around since 1992, except for the 8 years that I served as MPP. So I still enjoy what I'm doing, and I especially enjoy spreading the word about our historical society, about our museum, and about our stories. And when I say our stories, you will see, I think it'll be 2 slides in, and I'm going to use slides actually from our photographic collection at the archives to illustrate. You will understand that it was a 2-pronged project. It was a hydro project and a seaway project, and that will become very evident at the outset. So I will be asking Amy and saying the word next, so I didn't have to say it to get it started. Now, I'm hoping that there we go. There, perfect. We'll be covering in the presentation tonight an area from the city of Cornwall. Now that's at the right-hand side of the map that you're looking on. Now you can see Millrush there. Now on my screen I have folks down the right-hand side, and I don't know how to get rid of that to show the whole thing, but the city of Cornwall would be at the very right-hand side of this map. And then as we go from east to west, which is the left of the map, we had the communities of the little hamlet of Maple Grove. Maple Grove is that little triangle that you can see down on the river. Now the dark blue is the old river, the light blue is the flooded lands. So you can see Millrush, Mullinette, Sheik Island. We'll be talking about Sheik Island towards the end of the presentation, which was a farming community. Then you go upstream a little more and you get to Wales, the only inland lost village. And then you continue on, you get to Dickinson's Landing, then you get to the hamlets of Santa Cruz Woodlands, those 2 little triangles there where it says 1 and 2, Farron's Point, and Aultsville. And I do want to say at the outset that Morrisburg is shown on the map, but we don't classify Morrisburg as being a lost village. While there were 700 people affected and having to move out of the way of the project. Morrisburg still stands. Many homes from old Morrisburg are still there. And the South Dundas Historical Society really looks after the history and collecting artifacts and whatnot for Morrisburg. And then further up, you have Iroquois. Iroquois, the just over 1,000 people at the time of these hydro and seaway projects. We had about 1,000 people having to relocate to the new town of Iroquois. So we're the Lost Village Historical Society. When we say Lost Villages, there were 6 of them. There were 3 hamlets and the farming community of Sheik Island. So the next slide. This slide really gives you a good perspective of why there were 2 projects. Number one, in the background, you can see the Long Sault Rapids on the other side of the towpath, and that was that strip of land that you see from the bottom right heading up towards the middle left. That was the old towpath that was used in pioneer days to transport the bateau and whatnot and crafts up through the old canal. During my time, now I lived the Seaway. I was 6 years old when the project started. I was 10 years old when they blew the last cofferdam, and my dad brought us, my older siblings, and I'm number 2 of 12 kids, brought the older ones to see what was going on. And we learned a whole lot. And when I look at this, I can very much understand that you had power made from the Long Sault Rapids and the Seaway part of it in the foreground with, in this one, the Cornwall Canal. You can see 2 ships, one heading upstream, one downstream, and they are heading to Dickinson's Landing in that photograph. But those boats you see on the canal were canalers. Those weren't ocean-going boats. Those weren't lakers. Those were canalers. And it took 3 or 4 canalers to take a load from an ocean-going boat at Montreal. And that's where the bottleneck was in the old Seaway. They had to have this transfer of goods and then shipping up through to the Great Lakes. So the dream was in the 50s, and certainly there were plans over an expanded period of time that they would enlarge the Seaway and build a power dam at Cornwall to capture the power from the Long Sault Rapids. So that's what you have to keep that in mind when we see in our travels tonight the towns that were affected. And that's really what I'm here to talk about, what those towns were like, and a few little stories about life in those towns and other things. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a scene that I remember very well. I was at that event that you see right there. This happened on August 10th, 1954. I was 6 years old. I accompanied my dad and my oldest brother, Tom, and my brother next to me, John, and the 4 of us were down at where they were going to build the dam at Maple Grove, Maple Grove being that hamlet. And so they turned the sod, and in this picture, you see the Prime Minister of Canada on the left, Governor Dewey of New York State, Thomas Dewey in the middle, and Leslie Frost, the Premier of the province, on the right. And they had a ceremony there. And today, if you've been to Cornwall or been to the power dam, the site of that sod turning would have been right very near to where the power dam is located on 2nd Street West today in the city of Cornwall. Next slide. So here we are at Maple Grove, and the map that you see just above the OV in Grove, you can see the old river extending up through, and you can see on both sides of that river some light blue, the flooded lands. Well, on the right-hand side, snaking up on the right-hand side, there's diking right up to where it says Mill Rush. There's a huge dike there. There's diking over in the American side too, to create that head pond that was required for the dam that was built. And in fact, if you look above OV in Grove, you can see kind of a little straight line just above the V. That's where the power dam was built, crossing that river, crossing the international boundary between the United States and Canada. So that's why we had it as a joint project. The Americans were in on this. That's why Governor Dewey was here at the site on August the 10th, 54. And that's why today there's a monument at the center of the power dam with 16 turbines on the Canadian side, 16 on the American side. And then you had the water on July 1st, 1958, you had the water back up and cover 40,000 acres of land. 20,000 on the Canadian, roughly the same on both sides, a little less on the American side, but the spectacle of the whole thing was that on the American side, it was more in the loss of farmland and rural land rather than communities. They did have the small community of Louisville Landing and a street in Waddington, street or two in Waddington affected, but Waddington is still there. But on our side, there were 6 communities and 3 hamlets that everybody had to get out of the way. And we'll see tonight in our trip the moving of houses and whatnot. So let's take a look at Maple Grove next. So this is right across the center of that picture. You have highway number 2 with the Cornwall Canal, and this is Lock 20 at Maple Grove. And that's Mill Rush in the background. Right above center, you can see a large smokestack. That was the smokestack for the provincial paper mill. And we will see that when we get up to Mill Rush in the slides. But this is a site that I remember as a kid very well, going into Cornwall. In fact, the highway that you see just above the water in front of those houses, that was a highway that we took from Mullinette. I lived on a farm just on the outskirts of Mullinette, and we would head down to Mill Rush and then on into Cornwall on that road. Next one. Okay, these 2 houses were at Maple Grove, and well, obviously the words say operators' houses. They were the operators of the St. Lawrence Power distribution center. In 1901 at Mill Rush, and we'll see that, a power dam was built. In fact, the first flood on the St. Lawrence in our area, perhaps the first major flood. There were minor ones when some mill owners harnessed the water of the river, but the first major one was in 1901 when you had power starting to be generated at the Mill Rush Powerhouse, and it was transferred down to Maple Grove to a transformer station and distribution center, and the operators of that substation were housed in these 2 buildings. These 2 buildings today are in Long Sault. And as you see them sitting there on the cribbing, they sat in that form in 1956 into, I think it was late 56, on cribbing for at least 3 months before they were moved. And the next slide is going to show the moving of one of those houses out onto the highway and then on up to Long Sault. So this is the most easterly. You see City's service. That was a service station operated by Milton Matheson, and we'll see his house, I think, probably in the next slide. No, that's one of the operator's houses. We've just put that in because it's a beautiful winter scene. Next one. Oh, no, I guess we're going to see it later. But Milton Matheson, his house will come up. So know that it was down there at Maple Grove. So we move on up the number 2 highway, and where you see that long dotted line up through, well, a lot, I shouldn't say, the lines that are cut along there, that's the old highway, and the dotted line up through there is the old railroad. And you can see west of Millrush where the railroad was right alongside the number 2 highway, the King's Highway, and then the Queen's Highway. But we are now at Millrush. Millrush was the largest of our lost villages, with 814 inhabitants living there at the time of the Seaway, at the time of the projects, and all those people had to move away, either move to Long Sault, which was the new town created, or many folks moved to Thorold, Ontario, because we had a paper mill there, as I said before, and that paper mill moved to Thorold, Ontario. My father didn't move to Thorold. He worked there, as my mother did before she got married, worked at the paper mill, but my father didn't move to Thorold because he had all these kids and we lived on a farm. So he kept on farming, but then eventually did get into Howard Smith Paper Mill in Cornwall. But Millrush had 814 inhabitants. So we'll go on to the, and it was situated right on the Cornwall Canal, and you can see it coming up along where it says number 3, and then coming, and that's the dark line that I'm following. Well, I wish I could follow, but oh yes, I can. I'm hoping that all of you can see that. This is the Cornwall Canal. So when you get up here, Millrush took in an area about like that. And then you had Old Millrush over here, and it was lobbed off the newer part of Millrush when they built in about 1834, they built the first Cornwall Canal and divided the town. So Millrush, next slide. This is downtown Millrush. This is a scene that I remember very well as a kid. I don't remember that snowstorm, but I do know Mr. McClellan. I did know him. And he was a First World War vet, lost an arm in the war. But this is downtown Millrush with the IGA store. Next to it, the large brick structure, and that's where I got my haircut. I'd walk through that door right there. And I got my haircut by Vince Ross and his brother and sister-in-law. And his sister-in-law was my mother's sister. They lived in this apartment right in here. So I climbed those stairs many times as a kid, went over here on the deck and into the house. And then next to it, you had a store that had been in operation for at least a century. And that was the DeRoger general store. And then it was a hardware store at the time of the Seaway. And Mr. DeRoger moved his business to the new shopping center in Long Sault. And that building today was picked up and moved into Cornwall. And it's an apartment building today in Cornwall. Mr. Ross, who cut hair here, he cut hair in the barbershop in the Long Sault Shopping Center, and the IGA store. They built a food liner in the shopping center. So all these businesses were accommodated in the new shopping center that they built in Long Sault. And when I say they built, Hydro built. Hydro had to replace the business structures. Next slide. So this is the powerhouse that I was telling you about that went into operation in 1901. It had taken a couple years to build, but it went in operation. And the diking system, now this is the first part of the dike near the powerhouse, but it, if you look or if you think, it would move off to the right quite a piece. And there will be an aerial in a minute of the dike that was built to hold back the water of a lake that became known as Bergen Lake. Just as the lake that was created because it was man-made, Lake St. Lawrence, so did you have a man-made lake back in the first decade of the 1900s, and that was Bergen Lake, named after Darby Bergen, the MPP for our area. And he was also a medical doctor, and he was the first commanding officer of the SD&G Highlanders Regiment. Next. A painting. This is a painting that we have hanging at our museum of the powerhouse. So it'll give you an idea that it was a brick building, and certainly it from actually, if we go to the next slide, from this roadway and from this bridge, when you looked over, this kind of looked like a castle with that turreted tower at the front. But this is a great photograph showing the dike that was built, the water on the left, that's Bergen Lake. And in order to, this is going over to Sheik Island, and we'll talk about that later, but you crossed, to get to Sheik Island, well, here's the highway. There's the Catholic Church, the public school is here, the cheese factory was here, and the highway is right up along through here. And to get over to Old Mill Rush, you cross the swing bridge, right? And I hope my cursor is showing there.
Jeff,
And this level.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt quickly and let you know that I don't think we can see your cursor on our screens, unfortunately.
Okay, okay. I've been pulling it along, but anyway, I can pretty well describe it. At the top, you can see the church there. Just to the left of the church, you can see the swing bridge over to Old Mill Rush, which is that kind of island that you see there. And it was an island. I shouldn't say kind of, it was. And then you cross the diking system over the steel bridge, then over the weir, and the weir was there to keep the level of the lake at a pretty constant level, and then on up through to Sheik Island, along a road that passed by about 7 different Raymond family farms. Next. Another, there you see everything that I talked about, except this one shows the tail race of the powerhouse. Next one. An internal view of the powerhouse. And in my lifetime, I knew folks. Well, my barber, Vince Ross, not only did he cut hair, but he also worked at the powerhouse. And one of my best friend's dad, in fact, I'm having breakfast with my best friend, one of my best friends tomorrow, and his dad worked in here too. And we often talk about and reminisce about these things. Next slide. Another photo, but I put this in because the next slide, if we move to it, really shows you what destruction happened there. The whole upper part of the structure was dismantled. A crane would have come in and knocked down the brick walls. It had a steel frame on it. And today, this is a very popular dive site in Lake St. Lawrence. About mid photograph, just below, you can see some equipment in there. That equipment is still there. You can see down on the left-hand side, those 3 huge limestone arches. Those arches are still there. The turbines are there, and a lot of the steel equipment still there, but all that top part was dismantled and taken away. You don't see the girders or anything like that on the site. So a very popular dive site in our area. Next one. Yes, we're out on the middle at the bottom there. You're on highway number 2, heading around, and you basically left Maple Grove, and now you're coming up into Mill Rush. My aunt and uncle lived just down at the bottom of that photograph, and you can see that we'd passed the Catholic Church just to the right of center. The public school was next to it. Across the road, about just above mid-center, you had the cheese factory. And then you had the provincial paper mill. I already alluded to the fact that we had a paper mill, and it showed in one slide. And you can see that chimney that in the slide at Maple Grove, there's the chimney at the top right. And just above the paper mill, you can see an arch, a white arch. That's the Mill Rush Arena, a very popular place. I remember it very well. And this is where I went to school. I was an altar boy in that Catholic church there until they built a new church in Long Sault. And I went to school right next door to that church. And on my 10th birthday, January 29th, 1958, now you know, everybody knows how old I am, and that's okay. But on my 10th birthday, January 29th, we said goodbye to that school. And the following Monday, we were at Long Sault Public School. And how fortunate I was for 22 years of my 33 year teaching career, I was able to teach at Long Sault Public. And it was a lot of fun. And certainly the students had a good understanding of what was lost here and what our history was all about. Now, I do want to point out, just if you go to the center of the picture, you can see a house that has a cottage style roof. And it's the house walls are quite dark because it's brick. And there you have the cottage style roof. You will see that picture taken. You will see that house in a picture taken from over on the island in Old Mill Rush. And I think it might be the next slide, but it's coming up. Next. No, that's the church and the school. Next one. No, it'll be coming up there soon, but let's go back. No, we won't go back in slides, but let's go back and talk about the school for a second. This was the schoolhouse in Mill Rush that served until 1914. In 1914, they built a new public school. That's the one that I went to in grade 3 and 4 until January of 58. But you know, today we talk about recycling and repurposing and whatnot, and we try to encourage that. This school was split in two, and it was moved into different places in the village and converted into homes. And when the Seaway went through and Hydro relocated the houses out of Mill Rush, these two houses were moved into Long Sault on the same street. And I'm sure Hydro had no idea that they were parts, well, the two parts of the L-shaped public school up serving the children there until 1914. Next. Here's the house that I was telling you about with the cottage roof. Now we're going to see that house on the mover, actually, but think of the spectacular view that Mr. and Mrs. Warner. The house was built about 1922, and you can see it was an all brick house, and even the veranda posts, the base of the veranda posts, were made of brick. Well, those veranda posts were moved with the house, and you'll never believe this, but when you see, it might be in the next slide, I'm not quite sure. let's take a look at it. Yes, there we are. There's the house. You can see the chimney that served the fireplace that was in the parlor directly below that chimney. They moved the fireplace and that chimney intact, um, and moved the veranda posts, and there wasn't a crack in any of the brick when they plunked it down on the new foundation in Long Sault. And that's what's happening in this picture. The mover is backing up to the new foundation that was built. Now, Mr. Warner built that with the best of materials. He would not allow a board with a knot in it to be used in that house. And an interesting story is told about the move, in that Mrs. Warner was told not to pack her dishes, but she had forgotten to pack some plates that were on plate stands on the mantle. And when she went back in the house, after the house was moved, the plates were still on the mantle. And we have that story and a photograph of this house and the newspaper article framed and hanging in one of our buildings at the Lost Villages Museum. Very, very interesting. Next one. And I know a little bit about this house because I owned that at one time. After the Warners passed away, I was able to buy it. This gives you some idea at the tire and wheel size of the Hartshorn house movers. This was a company that was contracted to move homes. They moved 531 homes. They came up from Moorestown, New Jersey, and worked for about 3 years, moving houses in all our lost villages, plus Morrisburg and Iroquois. Next slide. We're still in Mill Rush at the paper mill. This just gives you an idea of the size of it. And this was right next, well, a couple lots over from the public school. And it was absolutely fascinating. The next slide will show, next one, again, the front part of the paper mill, which was of stone. And I remember when they knocked those stone walls down. Next one. Again, okay, you can see the stone walls again and the water tower at the paper mill, but I'm really getting to the slide that shows the destruction. Oh, I'm still not at it. And this is another idea of recycling, not something that was created and envisioned recently. These are ladies working in the sorting room for the scrap paper that came in. They were making sure that the contaminants weren't in it. And I knew at least 4 of the people in that picture personally. In fact, there's one lady at the just above center of that picture, and that was Thressa Brownell, and she babysat my siblings and I when we were very little kids. Next. Now we come into the destruction of the paper mill. There is the water tower down, and you saw it standing. They're cutting it up for scrap. You can see the torch there in the foreground. Next one. You can probably see, yeah, there's the crane. And they had that, it was quite a sight to be sitting in your classroom and seeing that crane swinging away at knocking down the walls of that building. Kind of sad knowing that my father lost his job there, and it had moved away. And but that's exactly what happened to many people. Fortunately for the Brownells and my family, we continue to live on the farm. They built a new railroad behind our farm. They built a new number 2 highway in front of our farm, and we were kind of sandwiched in the middle. But many of my friends had to move from Mill Rush to Long Sault or Mullinette, and it was sad for some of them. Next. Again, just another photograph of the mill coming down. Next one. This is downtown Mill Rush. The Millrush Horticulture Society had a beautiful little park right in the downtown. My father was the secretary of the Horticulture Society, and that sign that you see there is at our museum today, because I was with my dad when he went to that park, took that sign down, and it wound up in our barn. And when we opened our museum in 1992, my mother said that belongs at the museum. So it's been at our museum since 1992. With those buildings in the back, the building, the Manson Warner block behind there, it was destroyed by fire. The building just off the photograph on the right, an interesting happening took place this past Monday, just 2 days ago, when I met the nephew of the man who ran that restaurant and taxi stand out of that building. And we, that was something I love to do, is reminisce. And so he reminisced and I reminisced, and lots of fun. Next one. This is a very sad day. This would be July 1st, 1958. Standing right at the man standing closest to the center of the photograph was Floyd Barkley. And I think he's standing there with some members of his family. And I know his wife isn't the one standing to his left. The lady on his left, she's over on his right, two people, but he's standing near where his home was in Millrush. And the next picture really tells, there's Floyd Barkley, and he's a pretty sad individual on that day. He was Mr. Millrush. If there was anybody that knew his town more, well, that person didn't exist. Floyd Barkley was the president of the Chamber of Commerce. He was into all kinds of sports for kids. He was the one that initiated the drive for the Millrush Arena. He was the principal of Millrush Public School. He was Mr. Millrush. And I can tell you, I give credit to the man because he advocated for a lot of the citizens of the community who felt that they did not have a voice to speak to hydro. And there were many stories at the very beginning of the project about some of the deals that were made, and Floyd often thought that the deals could be better. So he did a lot of advocating for people. And in almost, I think in every village, you had somebody like Floyd Barkley. Next. Then we're up to Mullinette. Now this is really my hometown, Mullinette. This is where I went to school in grade 1 and 2. My father was born in Mullinette in a house that Thressa Brownell, and she's the one that was in that picture at the provincial paper mill. He was born in the house that she lived in, but we farmed, if you can see, just above the word Mullinette, not the big one across the top, but below it is a smaller, just above the U in Mullinette. You can see kind of the road goes straight north and then it connects on. Well, we were right at that corner. That's where our farm was. So you can see that a new highway was built, and that's the black line going up through, and the new railroad was built. That's the lines with the dots between them. And so you can see that we were sandwiched in the middle. And so great memories of this community. And you can see, for both Millrush and Mullinette, you can see Sheik Island out at the front of those two communities. And the residents of Sheik Island had a strong association with the residents of Millrush and Mullinette. Both these towns, plus the hamlet where it says number 3 there, of Maple Grove, they were moved into the new community of Long Sault, named after the Long Sault Rapids. And You can see that at the top left of the slide. And you can see the expanse of land out in front of the new community that was flooded. The river is the dark blue, so it was quite far out from where Long Sault wound up. But the shoreline, certainly after the flood, the water came back to come very close to the village. But they knew that the 240 foot above sea level would be about the level of the lake to level off at. Next one. So we're now in downtown Mullinette. This was St. Andrew's Methodist Church. It became united at the time of Union, and this church was built in 1834. Now, when I say this church, what the structure that you look at in that photograph is not the 1834, but the wood underneath it is, because the first church was a wooden church. And we have not photographs of the wooden church, but we have sketches of it done in the history of the Methodist Church. But in 1871, the brick, and that brick was just made on that's homemade brick. That's handmade at a kiln just north of Mullinette on the Annabelle farm. And it was remodeled in 1871, and then in the first decade of the 1900s, it was further remodeled in the interior. So it is in Mullinette the oldest church. There's another one that you're going to see shortly, but look at the location of this church. Right behind it, you had the cemetery, but beyond that, Bergen Lake, part of Lake St. Lawrence, and that Sheik Island beyond the Bergen Lake. So it was in a beautiful, beautiful spot along the Old Cornwall Canal in that village. Next one. The interior. Next one. They're inspecting the church. Obviously, they're looking at the beautiful stenciling that was in the church and whatnot. And I would imagine the guy at the back is somebody from Hydro, but I think the two at the front were church elders, and they're meeting with Hydro. Next one. And there's the church when it's on its last leg. There weren't too many more services in that church. The tree at the bottom left has been cut down. There's boards scattered all over the place. It's a rather a sorry sight. And the next slide will show that church on the last, when the last Sunday service was held at St. Andrew's United Church. There aren't many buildings at all left in the community. Above the church was J.G. Snetzinger's house and store. The store is the one with the two dormers on the roof, but at the time of the Seaway, T. Allen Brown had it as his store. But that was the Snetzinger farm, and J.G. Snetzinger was our MP and MPP. And one of the last buildings in the town to disappear would be at the very top of the slide, and that was the Lion Hotel. We'll see pictures of the Lion, but look at the other side of the road. Not a building left. My Aunt Ethel's ice cream parlor is gone. Few houses there are gone. The Texaco service station gone. The Orange Lodge has disappeared. It's all gone. And it's rather a sorry sight. So there aren't too many more days left for that community. I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom right. There is a cemetery that you saw in the previous slide, only the tombstones were standing in it. Here, there are no tombstones. The tombstones and some of the bodies there have been relocated to St. Lawrence Valley Union Cemetery, just west of the community where I live here at Long Sault. 14 cemeteries were amalgamated into St. Lawrence Valley Union. 2 cemeteries were raised. They were fairly close to the water. but Hydro felt that if they took the tombstones off, put more earth on, and put the tombstones back, they would be okay, and they have been. And then 2 cemeteries were moved intact, one being the Lutheran cemetery up west of Aultsville, and Maple Grove Cemetery. It was an Anglican church cemetery, and it stands today in Cornwall. And they moved those 2 cemeteries and set them up in the same configuration as they were at their former sites. So you can see that they've brought in tons of glacial till to put on there. And we have discovered that there were some grave sites in that cemetery that were concreted over. Concrete was poured over the top, and we only learned that recently. But it didn't happen in every case. Most of the sites there would have been covered with this glacial till. Next one. There's what happened to the church. They couldn't move it, so they torched it and then knocked down the walls. And it's many divers go around there. Many divers tell me that the tin from the steeple that you see down in the foreground is still there, around piles of brick, and the brick still there. But most of the brick and whatnot covered with zebra mussels. Next one. There is the church at the right, the Stetzinger house. And this house at the bottom left, as you can see, it was made of brick with a slate roof, and it was torched. And I remember that's a house that I have fond memories of, because I remember the lady that lived in that house. She ran a tourist home, very much like a bed and breakfast. And she was quite up there in years when I was in grade 1 and 2. And that would have been right across the road from that brick house. Next door to the United Church would have been the school house that I went to school in. And we were kind of afraid of this lady because she lived in this great big rambling house with all kinds of vines and whatnot growing over it. And, you know, it just, we might, I guess we were a little scared, but there was nothing to fear as we got older and realized. But I do remember after the ashes cooled at this site, going out there and taking, along with my brothers, and I think my 2 sisters were with me, taking and picking up some of the slates to take back to our farm and used for playing school or doing our arithmetic or whatnot on them. So, and they were just like the little slates that you would have had in the early schoolhouses of Upper Canada. Next. Christ Anglican Church. This church construction, this is the church at Upper Canada Village, and you'll see a picture of it. Actually, let's go to the next slide. I think it might be in it. Yeah, this is the one that I'm looking for. This is the church at Upper Canada Village, and it was picked off its foundation. Built in 1835, the construction started. Adam Dickinson, the most wealthy landowner in the village, gave the land and the money to begin the construction of the church. Unfortunately, in 1837, Adam's wife, Sarah, passed away, and her funeral was the first funeral held in the unfinished church. The following year, poor Adam passed away, and his funeral was held in the finished church. But this is Christ Church heading out from Mullinette. Next. There it is, a police officer directing traffic and probably telling motorists, go that way. But it was quite a sight. The bell still up in the tower. Many people have heard stories that the bell would ring, but I think the moving was so smooth that you wouldn't have the bell ringing up in there and tolling. So anyway, next. I talked about Adam Dickinson. This was his home. This began as the home of his father, but his father, United Empire Loyalist, didn't live too long to enjoy it. But this house should have been saved. I know that the reeve of the township, John Lawrence MacDonald, tried his best to convince officials in Toronto and Hydro to save this building because of its historic value, but they didn't. I remember going in that house after it was abandoned. The Dixons didn't live in it for many years. It had been converted into apartments. I remember going in as it awaited its destruction with my dad. And those two windows that you see upstairs there was a ballroom behind those two windows. It was very much like the structure of Cook's Tavern at Upper Canada Village, except this was a Georgian plantation style house. I think the next slide might show, that's a watercolor of the house. And on the left-hand side of the watercolor, you can see that there's no windows in the wall there, and that it looks like there was a structure up against it. And the next slide, if we go to it, you will see that yes, indeed, there was a servant's quarters on one side and the kitchen on the other side. And that's what that house would have looked like in its heyday, with a veranda across the front. But this was Adam Dixon, the mill owner and the giver of money and whatnot for the construction of the Christ Anglican Church. This is where he lived. Next. Okay, we leave Mullinette, go up the highway, and we're you can see that the highway was right along the riverbank, because you can see the dark blue. And then you took a road back and you took the lower road, it was called, to the only inland community, Wales. Now, Wales was north of Dickinson's Landing. In fact, Dickinson's Landing started at the very bottom of that road that you see extending back to the north at Wales. Dickinson's Landing started at that point out at the river and extended west beyond what this slide shows. But you can see Hooples Creek and whatnot in the village. But Dickinson's Landing, we'll talk about that later. But Wales gained its prominence because of the loss of what Dickinson's Landing experienced. There used to be at one time over 1,000 people living in Dickinson's Landing, but at the time of the Seaway, there were only 100, it was the smallest, 180 people living at Dickinson's Landing. However, at Wales, you had 210 at the time of the Seaway. Now, Wales was first called Dickinson's Landing Station because you can see that the railroad, the old railroad, is that dotted line there, did not extend out along the waterfront. It was back north of Dickinson's Landing. So they built a station there called the Dickinson's Landing Station. And in 1860, the Prince of Wales came to inaugurate the Grand Trunk Railroad. And he also wanted to go down through the Long Sault Rapids on one of those steamboats that we'll see some photographs of later. He wanted to do that. So legend has it that he got off the train at Dickinson's Landing Station, looked around, saw this small town, and he said, "Why does such a small town have such a long name, Dickinson's Landing Station?" So when he left town, the townsfolk petitioned to have the community renamed Wales in his honor. So let's take a look at a few sites of Wales. Next one. Yes. Wales was built around the farm of Dr. James Stewart. Dr. James Stewart received a huge tract of land, and it was known right up to time of the Seaway as the Stewart Tract. And it was farmed right up to the time of the Seaway by the Stewarts. Uh, Luckily for us, we have that house at the Lost Villages today, and there'll be more on that later. But this is, the Stewarts were right in Wales, and the pasture for these cows, and Hooples Creek that you see right there was in the village of Wales. Next. This is the Stewart house. This is the house that Dr. James Stewart. Now he didn't build that full structure, but the door that you see at the front of this house on the right, behind the veranda post, and the window there beside it, that's the parlor of the Stewart house today at the Lost Villages Museum. But the 1810 cabin that Dr. James Stewart's son had built on his land is beyond that. Dr. James Stewart would have had probably a log cabin, but his son built a more substantial home, and it was a slab on slab. And we have left the wall open in some of the rooms, and you can see the slab on slab construction in that museum. And I encourage you to look us up and come on down and visit us and see the beauty of this home. Next. This is Wales in 1957. It's about 20 houses have been removed from the community, but you can see St. David's Anglican Church is still standing up there mid-right, and the St. Mark's United right beside it. They're still standing in that big complex spread across the bottom of this slide. That was the D.H.C. Smith poultry yard, grist mill. He had a huge, an apple orchard, egg grading station and whatnot. It was a big complex. And we will see in a slide just in a few moments that his business and his structures were the last to stand in the community. But once again, you can see Hooples Creek winding its way just above the center. If you go across the center of the picture, just above there, you can see it coming through and then looping around up to the top right. That's Hooples Creek. And that area was certainly flooded. And it was flooded because Hooples Creek was on a low piece of land there. Unlike the other villages that were right along the river and flooded because of their close proximity to the river, this was an inland community, so it disappeared. Next one. This bridge, this is the Hooples Creek Bridge over the Grand Trunk Railroad. That bridge is still standing, by the way, but you'd have to be a scuba diver to go down and see it. As is the road bridge. The number 2 highway bridge is still standing. But I can tell you, our Historical Society's first president, Fran LaFlamme, she was my grade 4 teacher at Mill Rush when she moved us to Long Sault. She often told us the story of after the flood, she stood on the deck of that bridge. The water was so low in the lake that she was able to get out of the motorboat and stand on the deck of the bridge. Now, she didn't say how high the water came on her. She was a tall lady, but anyway, she often remarked about that. Next. This is originated as the Kerr Brother store in Wales, and this is in the horse and buggy days. The Kerr brothers had stores in Wales, Farron's Point, and that was their first store, and Aultsville. And the next slide is going to show you that it's really not the horse and buggy days. This is a little closer to the time of the Seaway, and you can see a bicycle there and whatnot, and a few changes in the front veranda structure and whatnot. But this picture we know was closer to the time of the Seaway than the other one that you just saw. But this, at the time of the Seaway, it was a store operated by Ransom, a Ransom and a Trimble family. Hence, the store was called Ransom and Trimbles. Next. This is the Conley Hotel, right built smack dab along the Grand Trunk Railroad, and they had a perfect spot. And there weren't many hotels in the area, but certainly in Wales. This would have been Wales, the only hotel in Wales. Luckily for us today, we have the ledger from that hotel, the guest lists and everything listed, quite an interesting read. And we also have a cupboard in the Stewart House at the museum. We have a cupboard from that hotel. Next. This is Arthur, and his nickname was Pop, and Mary Stewart's home in Wales. And this slide is in this presentation for the simple reason this was the heaviest house moved at the time of the Seaway. Now you can see it's a cement block home, concrete blocks, and usually cement blocks had air holes in them. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the construction of concrete cement blocks. This one didn't have air holes. Every block was reinforced with a bar of iron. So when they lifted that house with the hartshorn mover, those big tires on the hartshorn mover almost looked flat. Fran often told that story too. And I have to say, I'm so glad I had Fran as a teacher, because I learned so much from her. And then in years after having her as a teacher, just listening to her stories. But she produced a video before she passed away in 2000, using the best of her slides. And she talks about the flat tires on the hartshorn mover. Next one. St. David's Anglican Church. This church today could be standing out at Wales, but no buildings were allowed on the south side of the new highway that they had built. Hence, some houses in Mullinette could still be standing today, but nobody was allowed to live on the south side of the new highway. But this could be on an island on its own. Right out in front of St. Lawrence Valley Union Cemetery is a small island, and the deck of that church is still on that island. Those steps that you see at the bottom, those steps are still there. Very badly eroded and whatnot, but they're still there. You can tell. And we do have some bricks from that church. They're scattered all over the island. And so we have a display at the museum with the bricks. That little door at the bottom of the screen is the entrance to the hall. And I think probably, maybe not the next one. I think the next one shows one of the beautiful, oh yes, it is this one. You can see that Hydro kept people pretty apprised of what was going on. And this was a meeting in the basement of that church where townsfolk could come in and find out what their new village was probably going to look like. And they could get some idea if their houses were going to be replaced. Look at those boards at the back that you see, architectural studies. Those are diagrams of what the houses could look like. So there were a number of these meetings held. There were some meetings that got rather hostile, and because everybody, you could not, well, even today, you can't satisfy everybody, but certainly there were quite a few that couldn't be satisfied. But on the most part, most people felt they may be moving to a smaller lot in the new town, because in the old town, you had to have a big enough lot that would accommodate a well and a septic tank. When they moved into the new town, they had municipal water and sewer. So Hydro put their homes on, if they were moved, on new foundations and hooked them up. So that's why they didn't need a larger lot, for that very reason, for the contamination of well water. But you know, that's one thing that many people missed, but many people became satisfied with it. They They knew that this was life after the Seaway, that you lived in a community that was bigger than the one that they lived in, and where a neighbor from another town, another village, could be your very next door neighbor. Next. One of the beautiful stained glass windows out of St. David's Anglican. Next one. This is the D.H.C. Smith grist mill that I was telling you about. You saw the aerial slide. Next one, built right along the Grand Trunk. And this is, well, I can say just about a dead village. There's only the D.H.C. Smith complex back at the left on the horizon. You can see the structures. It's not a very good picture, but are very clear, but you can see the structures back in there. But everything else cleared out, including, I believe, the next house. Next slide. Right. This was the Warren house, the Warren and Rice house. It started out as the Warren, Mr. and Mrs. Warren, and the Warren daughter married a Rice, so then it became a Rice. And they sold insurance out of that little office that you see where that black door is. They sold insurance out of the little office there. And I can remember in 1969 buying my insurance at this structure when it was moved to Ingleside. But this was the largest single family home moved at the time of the Seaway. It wasn't the largest building moved, because the largest building moved was in Iroquois, and it was a 15-bed nursing home, the Williamson nursing home, and but it wasn't a single family home. This is the largest single family home. For many years, it operated after Rice, Eric Rice sold that. It operated as a bed and breakfast. Perhaps some of our viewers at one time stayed at the Nightingale House bed and breakfast. That was the home of the Nightingale House bed and breakfast. Next. So we leave Wales now. We're heading out back to the highway and then on up to Dickinson's Landing. Now, Dickinson's Landing, a long strip community with over 1,000 people living in it, but as I said, 180 people at the time of the Seaway. Next slide. The most prominent structure, now, at one time, Dickinson's Landing had 5 hotels. It was right at the head of the Long Sault Rapids. It had a wharf. It had one of the best wharves around, Cahoon's Wharf. It had 5 hotels in the community at one time. At the time of the Seaway, no hotels existed in the town. The largest and most prominent structure would have been this one that I remember very well. I worship at that church every second Sunday. Luckily for us, we have a couple items from that church at our museum. We have the bell that you see up in the belfry. We have it at the Lost Villages Museum, and the door handle that you see now. The doors below the bell tower, or in the bell tower, they weren't used much. In fact, I can never remember seeing them open, but we always went in that other door, and we have the handle of that door at the Lost Villages Museum. So we're lucky to have a few things from that church, but I remember it well, a beautiful brick church, and that was right out in front of the Dickinson's Landing Lighthouse that was moved to Upper Canada Village. And it was the entrance to the Cornwall Canal. Now, the Cornwall Canal extended for about 16 miles from Dickinson's Landing down to the east end of Cornwall. And there were many Sundays that we would come out of church and you'd look down across to the water, you'd be overlooking the cemetery, and you would see canal boats in the Cornwall Canal, or just entering the Cornwall Canal. Next one. The schoolhouse at Dickinson's Landing, and I think the next slide is probably going to show a better view of the same schoolhouse. And This picture, I'm always fascinated by it. Being a school teacher for all those years, I look at this as probably being a dress-up day at Dickinson's Landing Public School, because all the kids are dressed to the nines, and it must have been a dress-up day. I don't know what else it would be. Now, the bell in the bell tower, we're thinking that we might have it at the Lost Villages Museum, but we'll never be sure. Mr. Rothwell from Hydro was in charge of relocating and developing the new schools and public buildings for the towns that were going to be destroyed. And Hydro gave him a bell from one of the public schools destroyed. Now, there are a few schools that I know that the bell is not from, but I'm thinking that it could be from this school. But it's rather interesting that we have that. And that, it was a long, convoluted way of acquiring it, and it had made its way down into the States and then came back. And anyway, we have the bell at our museum for one of our Lost Village schools. Next. Long Sault, Dickinson's Landing, an area, great fishing. Here's a sturgeon. A couple lads from the village have caught a massive sturgeon. Next. People by the thousands came to Dickinson's Landing, and just to the east of Dickinson's Landing, lining Highway number 2, were many tourist establishments, cabins, and guest homes and whatnot, to accommodate the thousands of people that would come every year to see the Long Sault Rapids. And this is just one slide of many that we have of tourists that would stand along the highway. Now, the highway was on the other side of that cabin, but would move out along the front and look out and watch the water roll over the huge stones that were in the Long Sault Rapids. And when I say roll, and when I say that water that ran over these stones, there was between Cardinal, Ontario, and just east of Cornwall, and we call that Lake St. Francis, a 90-foot drop in the river. And it narrowed at the area of the Long Sault Rapids. So, and the biggest drop was right at the Long Sault Rapids. So that's why you had a spectacular rapid, the spectacular rapids at that spot, right out at a location just east of Dickinson's Landing. And Dickinson's Landing's claim to fame was it was really the home of the Long Sault Rapids. Next. There's one of the pleasure boats. This is the Rapids Prince. We do know that you had the Rapids King, Queen, and Prince, and you had the Britannic, and you had a few other of these pleasure-seeking flatter bottom boats that could ride the water of the Long Sault Rapids. And the last captain of the Rapids Prince, if you see in this photograph, he lived to see the rapids dried. They had to dry the Long Sault Rapids in order to build the second part of the Long Sault Control Dam. Besides the power dam, you had the Long Sault Control Dam, which controls the level of Lake St. Lawrence, and then you had the Iroquois Control Dam that controls the water coming in. But in order to build the second part of the Long Sault Control Dam, they had to drain the Long Sault Rapids so that they could build it on dry land. So in order to do that, they built a cofferdam, blocked the water, blocked transportation by the Rapids Prince or any other boat, and that was the end. But Captain James Stevenson walked down on the bed of the Long Sault Rapids, and he said, "I had to be crazy." And those words, there's a number of newspaper articles that relate to his experiences and his recollections of his life on those Canada Steamship Line. Prince, the Queen, the King, and the Prince. Next. Again, this is a shot very similar to the one that you saw at the very beginning of this presentation, but you can see the rapids prints from the back heading down through the rapids, and it would leave here and head down to the Cornwall Canal. It would pass the Mullinette. It would pass Millrush, Maple Grove, down into Cornwall, and on to Valleyfield and beyond. Next, Long Sault Rapids in winter never froze. That's why the people over on Sheik Island had gooseberries long before anybody on the mainland had them, because they had a microclimate over there because of the heat from the Long Sault Rapids in the winter. It just kept things heated up a few degrees more than it would have been on the mainland. And you can see the Long Sault the Cornwall Canal would freeze, but the Long Sault Rapids would not. Next. Dickinson's Landing. This is an interesting slide because you can see the population and there's nothing on it. So somebody must have come in after dark and wiped out the population of the town, because it's gone. Next. Then we come to the hamlet of Woodlands. Woodlands was known for its cemeteries, Woodlands East and Woodlands West. And that's where a number of my ancestors were buried. And it was known for its Presbyterian church, which I think we'll see shortly. Next. Okay, well, we're at Santa Cruz. That Woodlands might have been out of place, but Santa Cruz and Woodlands, you can see 1 and 2 were very close together. They kind of blended into each other. They didn't really become towns. Those were communities that if you blinked, you missed them, and it was basically rural. But you had Santa Cruz before you had Woodlands, but the church and that cemetery that you saw would have been midway between these two numbers that you see on the map. Next. Now, Santa Cruz, an interesting fact, Spanish terms for Holy Cross. And many people wonder, why would Santa Cruz be named for a community on the St. Lawrence that really it didn't have Spanish speaking people or Portuguese or the like? Well, history does record that Portuguese stonemasons did come and work on the masonry work that was required in the Cornwall Canal. So that's why this slide is in here, just showing some of the work that would have been done around those lock gates and whatnot and this would have been for the Farron's Point Canal, part of the Williamsburg Canal system. Next. When I say Williamsburg Canal system, this is lock number 22 of the St. Lawrence Canal system, but this is the most easterly of the Williamsburg canals. The Williamsburg canals went up to Morrisburg. So this is the most easterly one. You had the Cornwall Canal, well, you had the Lachine down near Montreal, and then you had others, the Beauharnois, et cetera, and then you got to the Cornwall Canal, which was the longest. Then you got into the Williamsburg, and we know that this site that you're looking at, and this was taken on dry land, this site today is still underwater, except for that structure about mid left of the photograph. The gates were taken down, and the chambers are there today, along with the limestone. Next. Santa Cruz, the schoolhouse, was about the only public structure in this little hamlet. And the next slide will show the same school. So we'll move on to the next slide, and we come to Woodlands, and that's the number 1 there. And this is where I think we're going to be able to show the the church in a second, but I want to draw your attention up there to Ingleside, the new community of Ingleside. And that is, you can see over on the right, a roadway that kind of curves around on an island there. Well, that's the start of the Long Sault Parkway at the west end. So Woodlands was from that number 1 that you see there over to that island. That would have been the area of Woodlands. The church was right off the tip of the, if you see that curve, go to the end of that island. That's where you would have had St. Matthew's Presbyterian Church. Ingleside took in the communities of Wales, Dickinson's Landing, Farron's Point, and Aultsville. It was known as town site number 1. Took a long time for the townsfolk there to decide on what the name of their town was going to be. Long Sault was right off the bat, knew that they were, the people there knew that they would be named after the Long Sault Rapids. But in Ingleside, they even had a contest. They had a couple contests, and they even had a vote, and the vote didn't satisfy the townspeople. So what happened was that the reeve of the township was out for a drive one night with his wife, Thorold and Helen Lane. And as they were driving up west of Aultsville, now you can see Aultsville on this map, they were driving west along the highway, and they looked, Helen looked up and she said, "Ingleside, wouldn't that be a nice name for our town?" This was the sign that was hanging on the veranda of the house that the Hickey family lived in. So anyway, Thorold brought it back to council. She brought it back to the townsfolk because she was just about in every organization in the community. And they decided that their town would be called Ingleside from then on. So let's take a little look at Woodlands. Woodlands believed name because of the stands of trees in the area, but more likely from the cordwood that would have been piled at the dock out in front of the road that extended from the north. There was always wood piled up there for the steamboats. Not in my day, but certainly before that. This, if you ever come to the Long Sault Parkway and you see McLaren Island was named after this farm right here. This was the McLaren farm. And you can see that they had chickens and whatnot. You can see the little pens at the back there and the big chicken coop. And Reverend Narcisse McLaren establishing Camp Kagama on Sheik Island, and we'll get into that as we go. Next. This is Woodlands. This is, I keep forgetting this woman's name, and I still can't remember it. I just put it in because it's kind of a sad one. The family, she and her family, Ruth Campbell, and their children, Judy, Eric, and Bill, watching the water come over the highway at Woodlands. And the Campbells had a tourist home there in pre-Seaway days. Next. We come to Farron's Point, and Farron's Point was the second smallest of the lost villages, with 184 in it at the time of the Seaway. Next slide. Farron's Point was right on, and I already mentioned about that being on the Williamsburg Canal system, and this is a boat going upstream. The boats at Farron's Point could go downstream. There was a minor rapid out in front of Farron's Point. The boats could shoot the rapids because they were minor, but they couldn't get back up. So they had to be locked up, and that's what's happening in this picture. The canaler is being locked up. I want to draw your attention to the lockmaster's house, just to the left of the boat in that picture. And up on the canal bank, way up on the left, you can see a pavilion that was built by the Women's Institute, and it had a Nickelodeon, and there was a snack bar there, and many people recalled. And one of our first projects for the Historical Society was to interview the older people, and the folks from Farron's Point often talked about the pavilion and what fun it was there, and what a spectacular view they had down to the boats that were passing through the community. Next. Here, a colored picture of it, and you can see the two structures, below the center and near the ship. You can see the lockmaster's house, and you can see the pavilion. That pavilion was saved, and it's still standing today at the Stormont Agriculture Society's fair that they have on Labor Day weekend at Newington, a short distance from where I live here at Long Sault. Next. There we have a couple Farron's pointers. They're pretty close to the end of the life of the lockmaster's little house there. Next one, because this shows the two folks, and those two were employees at the Farron's Point lock, at lock number 22. Next one. The main street of Farron's Point was highway number 2. You can see the tree lined, and this is just a beautiful scenery, and Black's store and pumps and whatnot. Just a beautiful scene. Next one. This was Farron's Point's most famous building. This was Buckingham Palace, and it was called Buckingham Palace. This was the Kerr brothers. Now, I already mentioned Kerr having a store in Wales, and the mother store was in Farron's Point, and another one in Aultsville. But this was their first store, the Kerr brothers. Most of it was made of brick. The corner that you see wrapping around the street, now that's number 2 highway in front of it, and then you had a street angling off to the north. And they built that structure to the angle of the road. But not only did they build it, the structure like that, but they had beautiful, underneath the eaves, beautiful woodwork under there, beautiful woodwork across the front of the wood part of the store, dormers with gingerbread and whatnot, and the cupola at the top. And I think the next slide will be just a little close-up of the cupola, and just fancy work in that. So the townsfolk called it Buckingham Palace. Next. There's a watercolor. One of our Historical Society members, Anne-Marie Shields, wrote Lost Villages, Found Communities. And not only did she provide the history of the communities, but she also illustrated it. She's an artist, and she's illustrated almost every page of the book. Beautiful illustrations. Next one. There's a boat heading into, and you can see at the middle right of the slide, the entrance, the eastern entrance, because it's heading down. The boat in the foreground is heading upstream, so it has to be locked through. But you can see the Rapids Prince in the back, and it's heading downstream, heading towards the Long Sault Rapids. Next. Then we come to Aultsville. Aultsville was our second largest. If Millrush had 814, Aultsville was in second place at 312. And it was known as our brick town. Now, why was that? Because it had 2 brickyards, the Elliott Brickyard and the McConnell Brickyard. And the community was really split in 2. The major part of the town would be around the point of that arrow that you see under Ault. And the industrial park of the town would be at that little square box or rectangular box you see above the U in Aultsville. And that was only because the railroad went through and it couldn't extend out closer to the front. So they built the station just a short piece to the north of the main part of downtown. And we'll see that could be in the next slide. I'm not quite sure. No, this is the government wharf. This was the wharf over to Louisville Landing. I mentioned earlier on that New York State lost Louisville Landing and a couple streets in Waddington. Well, this was the government wharf, and there would have been another wharf over at Louisville Landing. And that's Steen Island that you see with the boat in behind it. Now that boat is in the main channel, and Steen Island gave Aultsville a nice, more not as swift running as water as you would have had out where that boat is situated. Next one. Very popular swimming place. Next. Now, this was one of the first ferries that transported folks between Louisville and Aultsville and vice versa. This is a 2-horsepower ferry. You can see the 2 horses on the treadmill there at the back. You can see Napoleon Brownell, my relative, on the tree, standing with his arm on the wheel. And my sister-in-law's great-grandfather is that's his horse and wagon. So I have family kind of wrapped up in this, but it's one of the earliest slides we have of early transportation on the St. Lawrence between these two communities. Next. This is back at the industrial park. Now that's where, if you remember on the map, there was that little square. This is where we are right now. We're not out at the river. We're going to be there in a few minutes, but we're back. Obviously, you can see we're at the railroad. And this was the Jarvis and Shaver General Store. And you can see that there was a house there at the corner, a couple of houses. You can see one behind the trees. And there was a road that extended up between that White House that you see and Jarvis and Shaver Store. There was a road that extended up to the Aultsville station. And there were a number of, the next slide might show, yes, some of the structures that were around there. The smoke coming out of the stack there, that would be the cheese factory. It was the Edwards Brothers Cheese Factory, and then it became Borden's. This is the egg grading station. There's the Jarvis and Shaver Store. In behind the Jarvis and Shaver Store, near that huge tree at the back, would have been the Rombo Sash and Door Factory. And then you traveled up a little bit, you arrived at the Aultsville station. One of 2 stations saved at the time of the Seaway. The Aultsville station was moved to Chrysler Park near Upper Canada Village. And the Mullinette station is at our museum today, but it was purchased by a farmer for $10 and moved back to his farm. So next slide. This is Mr. Jarvis in his store. Next slide. I put in the next slide, still Mr. Jarvis, but I want you to take a look at the bottom left. It's hard to believe that Cow brand baking soda, this slide is over 60 years old and the box hasn't changed in all those years. I find that remarkable. Next slide. There's probably some other goods there on the shelves that haven't changed much either. But this is, you can see that the egg grading station is gone. The railroad tracks are gone. Jarvis and Shaver Store is coming down. And I just wish that we had that sign at the Lost Villages Museum, but we don't. Next. Then now we're out at the water. We have the St. Lawrence River beyond that little swing bridge there. This was a swing bridge that brought those in the village out to a park that was operated by the Aultsville Men's Club. And the Aultsville Men's Club built that bridge. The Aultsville Men's Club existed up until just recently. I would say just pre-COVID, they shut down in Ingleside, but they did a lot of work for our communities, not only in the old town of Aultsville, but in our new community of Ingleside. Next, we see Frances Bedingfield and her son Johnny on that swing bridge. I believe they have just stopped and they're probably heading home from some time out in the park. Next. This is St. Paul's Anglican Church, one of 3 churches in the community that disappeared. And it was only recently, I do writing a monthly report in a magazine that's published locally. And in my research recently, lo and behold, I suspected that the belfry was an add-on. And sure enough, my research did draw me to the fact that it had a little porch at the front. The roof was taken off the porch, and the belfry was added in a different color brick. They couldn't get the same color brick, so they built it in a different color. But the stained glass windows out of that church and the other Anglican churches, St. David's Anglican Church, they are now in Christ Anglican Church in Long Sault. Next. There's the same church and the parsonage next door. George and Nancy Hickey. George taught at Aultsville High School. He also taught in Ingleside. They lived in this house, and they moved with the house to Ingleside, and they lived there until they had their new house built. And this house stands on Pine Street, just looking exactly as you see it there. I even think the gingerbread is on the house there in Ingleside. Next. Aultsville, known as our brick town, and you can see why. Take a look at the brick of many of the structures on the left-hand side of that. Even down beyond there, you can see the high school. You can see the fraternal hall, the hall that the Masons and the Orange Lodge had as their meeting rooms, but they were all made of brick. Hence the brick town. Next one. The Dr. Hickey's grand home on Main Street, highway number 2. Next. And now this one really shows, and this is perhaps the most famous photograph that Hydro used of any of the towns when illustrating stories and whatnot in publications. Not only because of the structures that were in it, they were all brick, but because it just shows how they were lined up in this quaint fashion. And this shows the Bank of Montreal on the left, and then the red roof Defo store, and then you had McConnell's barbershop down in there, but they were all brick. Rather interesting. And the Dr. Hickey's house is on the right-hand side. Just go down the sidewalk and you can see the same house that I showed you before down there on the right, on the along the sidewalk. Next. Now, Aultsville was named after Nicholas Ault, a United Empire Loyalist, and this is the Ault home. Now, this was the enlarged Ault home. The old original home was enlarged, but this, I do remember this house in downtown Aultsville, and I remember my dad saying that this was the house that the Ault that this town was named after, that they lived in it. Very fortunate for us, this year we acquired a carpet out of that house. It was donated to our historical society, and it's now on display up in the Masonic Lodge room in the Stewart House. We have one half of the upstairs in with memorabilia and whatnot from the Masonic lodges from our lost villages, and it's in there now, but not walked on by the public. Next. This is an aerial view. Now, this photograph was taken by Louis Helbig. Louis Helbig is a photo artist, and he was up in his airplane a number of years ago, I would say about 10 years ago maybe, and he looked out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of foundations and roads and whatnot, and then he started exploring, and this is what he saw at Aultsville. You're really looking at water. Now, you can't see the water. You're seeing structures underneath the water. Highway number 2 extending right through the middle of the screen. The Bank of Montreal, you can see the road going to the north, and the Bank of Montreal is on the left. Defo Store Foundation on the right. Go south or to the bottom, and you're crossing highway number 2, and you have the road out to the wharf, and that long white strip down the center to the bottom, that's the sidewalk that passed right beside the Ault home, and it's to the left of that sidewalk. So that's having seen some of the structures in town, now you know the configuration in what somebody would see if they were up in a Cessna airplane and looking down. And a lot of these sites have, well, sometimes the water is low, but the zebra mussels have cleaned up a lot of the river. They have damaged the ecosystem for a number of the fish, but they have allowed people like Louis Helbig to tell our story in another way, and that's through these images. Next. The schoolhouse, and this was the high school, and the public school was at the back. And the next slide is, oh no, I thought it had the fraternal hall. That schoolhouse and the fraternal hall next door, thank you, and the fraternal hall next door were burned down, and it was a controlled burn. The National Research Council came down and used 11 structures in this community, frame structures and brick structures, to understand combustion. They were researching smoke detectors and smoke alarms and whatnot. And so that technology is a result of work that was done at the time of the Seaway when these buildings were going to be lost. So this building was torched. We do have photographs of this church burning, and rather sad. But yes, the next slide is Mr. Scott, where Aultsville used to be. And again, just as in some of the other slides that I showed, there's nothing left. The sidewalk, and that sidewalk today is kind of the sidewalks that you would see in Louis Helbig's images from the air. Next one. Then we come to, we're backtracking down to Sheik Island because it's an island. We're leaving it as a standalone. You got over to Sheik Island from Millrush, and I explained all that. But Sheik Island was a farming island. It was owned by the Mohawks of St. Regis on the most part. In fact, I think it was 7 Raymond family farms were located on that island, and they had long-term leases with the Mohawks of Akwesasne for their farms on that island. Next. This is one of the Raymond homes, beautiful, beautiful stone home. Mr. Raymond sitting out front relaxing, probably just sold his Ayrshire cattle and just waiting on he having to move. Next. There's the image from Lost Villages Found Community book. Next. Mr. Raymond again, and the side view of the house. And the next one is a rather sad image of the house, and the house hasn't burned in that picture. Mr. Raymond took as much material out of the old house and incorporated into his new house that he built here in Long Sault. So the banister, the wood paneling, all the ornamentations, the beautiful door frames and doors are in the house here at Long Sault. And I can tell you the Kite family that own that house today treat their home with such tender, loving care, and they know the history behind it, which is wonderful. Next. Sheik Island was inhabited by the Point Peninsula people. Now, we're talking about pre-Mohawk time, by the Point Peninsula people. The University of Toronto knew that there had been an encampment here, a village, burial ground and whatnot. So they came down and did a dig I remember going up to that site on a Sunday, probably it was in 1957, and they had a kids' day, and you could do a dig. And my brothers and I didn't find a darn thing in the time that we spent there, but it was fun, and we learned all about what this was all about. But the university took out an injunction to have the project stopped because they wanted to do more work. And it was rather sad that at the very end, they had to bring in bulldozers to do the last of the work there. But all that material, all the material that was found and whatnot, I do know that the Mohawks of Akwesasne, there's some on display, I believe, down at the power dam in Cornwall at the visitor center. But most of it's at the University of Toronto Archaeological Department. Remember that. And this was in Ault Park. This is Ault Park at the head of Sheik Island, a park that was established in 1914. And that park was replaced with the new Ault Park over on the mainland. And that's where our museum is today. Next one. This is our local newspaper reporter, Alec Mullen, and he's posing. He had somebody take his picture, but he was there doing a report, not helping the archaeologists. Next. Houses were destroyed. Next. Houses were moved. Now, here's where the Matheson house from Maple Grove, I thought it was earlier in the slideshow, but it's not. This is the Matheson house. This again is a block house, and this was the first house moved into Long Sault. I have a document that I know exactly the day that was lifted off its foundation. I know exactly the day that it was set down on its new foundation, and it usually took 1 to 3 days for that kind of thing to happen. And I would know where Mr. and Mrs. Matheson went when this move was on. A lot of people stayed at stopover houses. I suspect that the Mathesons, I don't have it with me here in my study at the moment, but I imagine they went and stayed with relatives or even at a hotel. Next. This was a house down at Maple Grove. Now, I have this is near our museum. In fact, that log fence that you see there is in front of the Stewart House, the museum, but right across County Road number 2 stands this beautiful brick home. This was the home of Stanley and Kay McNairan at Maple Grove. And Stanley, because he had waterfront property down at Maple Grove, wanted waterfront property up where in the out in front of the museum or up near Long Sault or someplace. He just wanted waterfront property. Well, Hydro said nobody is going to live on the south side of the number 2 highway. Well, that ticked poor Stanley off, but he was very, very upset when Hydro came to his house, looked at it, and declared it not structurally sound enough to move. But it was moved. Stanley, being the loyal descendant of a United Empire loyalist, decided to take the money from Hydro, but keep his house. And he hired a private contractor to come in, took all the brick off the house. Now, that's not brick veneer, that's double brick. And took all the brick off the house, cleaned all the brick up, moved it up to the site here, and moved it here as a frame building. Now, where were Stanley and Kay McNairan on Christmas Eve, 1957? We know the flood was on July 1st, 58, but on Christmas Eve, 1957, Stanley and Kay McNairan were in their frame house with it sitting on the mover, and it was a private mover, stuck on the new highway that was being built just east of where you see this house standing today. It was stuck there. So Stanley and Kay lived in there over the Christmas holidays. They had a pantry full of food. They had water. They could melt snow and whatnot. They had a wood stove in the kitchen, and they had chamber pots. So they were all set. So they lived there. A rather interesting story. And Stanley often chuckled at that one of the experiences of contending with the move. So the next 3 slides we can go through rather quickly. will show close-ups of the house. So there it is, and that's right across from our museum. Next one, there it is again, and the next one. Now, Stanley wasn't happy, nor were people in the city of Cornwall. This was a Citizens Joint Action Committee, and this big billboard was put up with the wants that these people wanted on the Canadian side of the river. They wanted a 27-foot canal on this side of the river. They wanted suitable rehabilitation for landowners and the restoration of recreational areas. And they wanted protection of Cornwall's and Canada's interests. So this big billboard was put up in Memorial Park in Cornwall. I'm very surprised that it went up there, but you can see that there's the statue that still stands today in the cenotaph that still stands in Memorial Park. Next one. And then this poor guy, he really got ticked off with Hydro, and he put up this billboard, homemade one, out at the front of his farm up near Aultsville. And he just, he didn't feel that he was being treated fairly. And there were a number of people, but I can tell you on the most part, most people were satisfied. Next. This is a hydro sign that we have at our museum. This was donated to us within the past 7 years by a member of our historical society. And when he donated it at one of our meetings, he told us that it was like a monkey off his back. This was a sign that was put up on his house, on his father's house in Millrush, after they had moved out of it because they had to relocate. The house was going to be torn down. But when they arrived down at the site at Millrush of the house was still there, but this sign was attached to the tree, and it said that they couldn't trespass. Well, Mr. Day pulled that off the tree and kept it all those years, and it was passed on to his son, and his son donated it to the Historical Society. Next one. This was July 1st, 1958, the big kaboom. Everybody thought that there was going to be this great wall of water because for at least a year, if not longer, a lady in Cornwall, she sang the songs. Her husband played the guitar, Morris and Loretta Burgess. Loretta wrote the lyrics, and the lyrics in the Seaway song, it says, and they go, this great wall of water will make its own headway right into the old Cornwall shore. Well, we all believed that once that last cofferdam was blown, that this great big tidal wave would come in and come slapping down against the dike and the dam at Cornwall. Well, it didn't happen. It took 3 days for the head pond to fill. And, you know, the rest is history. 40,000 acres of land, and we have a new lake. Next one. Just a quick trip around the museum. This is part of the museum, the Mullinette station, the barbershop and store over here. Those were sold by Hydro for $10 each. The station moved to a farm at Avamore. The barbershop and store moved just north of Mullinette. We have a blacksmith shop in there. We have the log house, our first museum. Next slide. Yes, the next slide. Yes, our first museum was in that log house. On August the 10th, 1992, I had become president of the Historical Society in May of that year. And one of the conditions to accept the presidency that I put in front of Fran LaFlamme was that if she and the rest worked to open that as a museum, because it sat there from 1985, only opened during Celebration 30 in 1988, and it was locked up. And so anyway, by August the 10th, 1992, we were able to open our first museum. Next one. Again, a schoolhouse was acquired, a church was acquired. Next one. A brick library built in 1901 was given to us by the municipality. It served as a library for many, many, many years, and then it closed because of lack of patronage by the the community, and it was the grandson of Isabella Forbes, who this library was built to honor. The grandson appeared at a council meeting. I was the reeve at the time. I was also the president of the Historical Society, and he encouraged the township and the Historical Society to move it down to the museum and open it as archives and a library. So that we did. Next one. And this is the Stewart House and our pride and joy. All the buildings are our pride and joy, but this is a very special one. And I hope that you will all make a journey down. If not this year, next year. We have an archival center where a lot of researchers come, especially if their roots are along the front. And we would be happy to have you. You can always find us at just by Googling lostvillages.ca. And we're also on Facebook, Lost Villages Museum on Facebook. And that's probably where you get quicker information with regards to events that we're having, et cetera, on our Facebook site. But we have both, and we're having a fabulous year this year. It's going to be, we had our COVID years where we couldn't open, and we did open last year. It wasn't all that great, but this year is very, very good. Anyway, next one. And this is the last slide, and this is highway number 2. As you can see, right out in front of our museum, there are 2 camps. One is the Sea Cadet Camp, and this is at the Sea Cadet Camp. The other is the Air Force Camp, the Air Cadets. And this is old highway number 2 at Mullinette. In fact, one of our members, just off to the right of this photograph, his home was located there. And we take a lot of people out here to show them downtown Mullinette. So as every slide presentation has to come to an end, mine has come to a dead end. So I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jim. You have so much information about the Lost Villages. It's quite remarkable. We had a few questions come in through the chat box. So I'll just, if you have time, I can go through a few of those. The first question was, did a full 3-dimensional model of the Seaway project exist at the time?
At the time of the Seaway?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. That was at the University of Toronto. I wish it was still in existence, but it's not. But when I was the MPP here, it was pointed out to me when I was in Toronto, the building that model was built. I wish it was still around, but we have photographs of it, and it was well documented in newspapers and whatnot. Yes.
Another question in the chat was, what percentage of the buildings were moved?
Well, I would say probably, and I have been asked that question before, and I would say probably around 70% moved. I do know that when I look at Mullinette and Millrush, now one thing that we just acquired at our museum is, and we have it on a little USB stick, every house, whether moved or burned or whatever, moved by a private contractor, we have photographs of every house now moved affected by the Seaway from Maple Grove up to Iroquois, which is amazing. But when I look at Millrush and Mullinette, those are the towns that I was closer allied to because I went to school there, church there, and whatnot. And I think of the people living there, I would say about 70% of the houses.
Just my own question from that. what was the primary reason why some of the buildings weren't moved as opposed to the other 70%?
Some, as Stanley McNairn's, he was told that it wasn't structurally sound enough to move, but obviously Stanley proved them wrong. At the very end, I was talking about the slide where the road went off into the water, and one of our members had lived right beside there. His grandfather's house, the barbershop was saved, and it's at our museum today. A farmer bought it for $10, and then we acquired it after. But the house was torn down. We have a slide of that house and the rafters. You can see the rafters, and they're tearing it down. But Hydro did come into the house and told Ziny Hill that his house wasn't structurally sound enough to move. Then you had some that were just massive. The one that at Mullinette that was on fire, brick house with the slate roof, there was no way that they could ever, I don't think, move that. Maybe today, yes, but you know, something else too that just boggles my mind, and I'm sure it boggles the mind of a lot of people on this presentation tonight, that without a computer, GPS, or any of those modern conveniences, Hydro was able to accomplish this in the time that they did. The construction in 4 years, a few years perhaps before that, doing some of the geology work and whatnot, and getting soundings and the like, but that they did it all with slide rules. That's what you had back then. You had a slide rule. You know, we had a visitor at the archives the other day, and that visitor was talking about that very thing. And he would be old enough to know that was the era and the time that slide rules would have been used for the engineers and whatnot. Yeah, so there were a number of reasons why they weren't. There were some people that just wanted to build a new house. Hydro would have a new house built, and they would abandon their old house. Some of the old houses were moved and turned into stopover houses and rented out by Hydro, and then eventually sold. But a lot of them were, there were those that were destroyed for one reason or another, but it was mostly because they couldn't be moved. They weren't structurally sound enough to move.
Did anyone want to unmute themselves and ask any questions of Jim?
I do want to say that if anybody has a question, all they have to do is go on our website, and there's a page there where you can reach me. It does go to our email and social media secretary, but all those come eventually to me. Within a week I get them. But if you have any questions afterwards, or if anything comes up, but just let me know. And certainly if you ever want to plan a trip to the museum and you would like a tour, I'm happy to give tours. Next Tuesday I'm giving one to some folks that are coming up from South Carolina, and so then that will be a private tour, and there I point out some of the little hidden secrets that they just might not see. I see somebody with a hand up there.
Okay, you were asking about questions. One of the things I just wanted to clear up, Jim, because I'm from Wales, and my father had a store there. One of the things that you seem to say that Hydro would build new houses. What I understood at the time, and I was about your age too, is that what they did is they bought the house, and then people took the money and they got a free lot in one of the new towns, and then they would then the homeowner would hire somebody to build their house.
Yes, but I think there were some that in parts of the whole project that Hydro may have, I think they did. But yes, you had the option of hiring your own contractor for sure if you wanted to. And
they did replace churches, and they put in the shopping centers, and they did the libraries, and anything that was in one of the original towns,
the public
Hydro would replace with something new in the new town.
Yes.
I should have said in the old villages, and then they would replace it in the new town. But most of the people who built a house, they were given a free lot, and then they in turn would be able to build a house on it.
Yes. Yes, that would probably be in most instances absolutely correct. I do want to point out too, and is it Lynn
Yes.
Markle? Yeah,
Yes.
she commented about the churches and whatnot. If a church had a hall,
Yes.
they would usually build a hall beside the new church. But I'm going to give you an example of our church at Long Sault. We had a church at Mill Rush, and that was St. George's Chapel, that little white chapel right next to the school. And it sat on a rubble foundation. It did have a furnace in the cellar, but it didn't have a concrete floor in it. Hydro did not put a concrete floor in the new church they built in Long Sault. The men of the parish had to put that in. I remember my dad going up there and helping on that project. It was rather interesting,
Yes.
the deals that had to be made.
It's right. My father was on the planning board. So there was a planning board for each new town. And those people had to really negotiate with Hydro. If
Yeah.
they found an old tennis court in Wales, which there was, then they said, you got to have a tennis court in Ingleside. Or
Right.
whatever was in one of the villages that was a piece of basic infrastructure, like schools and so on. They would push for the replacement, and then they had some input into what that would look like. The Wales United Church had a church and a hall that was separate, but the new church, it was connected, and that's what and there was a church boulevard and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So also the planning of the two new towns was very different. Long Sault is very different than Ingleside in terms of its design. And the streets and the central area and stuff like that. And that had a lot to do with the people who were involved in the planning. So my dad was on the Thor Lane, a bunch of men. I think they were mostly men. I don't know if Fran was involved or not at that point in time. But they were definitely, it was good that there was some input from local people in terms of the design and of course the names and all of the name of the town and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's why I referred to Floyd Barclay down at Mill Rush, and I said the other towns had their leaders. So who was your dad?
Stuart Markle.
Oh, Stuart.
Yes, he had a store in Wales.
Stuart and Helen.
No, it's Margaret. My mother's name was Margaret, and they had
Margaret.
And Stu, the bald-headed grocer.
Right.
And they had a store in Ingleside for many years.
Oh yes. Oh, Margaret Markle. Oh, what a sweet lady she was. Oh my goodness. Great memories of many conversations with her. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Sorry for reminiscing to all those others still in the, but
well, I missed your presentation down at the dam at the power plant, and so I decided to come in on this, even though I'm not from Almont or the Lanark area. So thank you very much for letting me listen in and reminisce.
Oh, were you one that thought that when it was advertised as virtual, that it was going to be a virtual tour that I was going to give for
today, you mean?
Or last Sunday?
I wasn't sure what it was. I wasn't sure if it was a film or what you did. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. Okay. Well, thank you.
I just wanted to ask also a very quick question, because my mind boggles at the amount of work that was done to make this possible. And thank you very much for all the work you did in giving us this presentation. But is there any estimate about how expensive this was? And are we still paying for this?
Nope. You are not still paying for it now. Yes, this is something that I don't have in the top of my memory bank, but I do have it here. The Seaway part of it, it was, and this is in $1958. The Seaway part of it, Canada's the cost to Canada was 330 million. The cost to the United States was 128 million, for a total of 458 million dollars. That's in $58, 1958. For hydro, it was a $600 million project. So that
yeah.
I don't get that question very often, so thank you for it. But I'm glad I have my little book. I try not to refer to my little book too often.
It's good to have a little book, yes,
Oh, yes.
because again, it seems like, money was just being, well, thrown into the water, basically. Like, wow, indeed, very, very dramatic, this
Well, it
story.
all did go into the water to create a lake. Yes, but we've had a lot to celebrate in our communities
Yes.
since. As Lynn Markle said, her parents, my goodness, I knew her mom more than her dad, but they were in the shopping center in Ingleside. And
Yeah.
Margaret Markle, she was into everything. She was very involved in her community.
Yeah, well, it's true. And it's lovely that the people that have their stories recorded have the possibility of still visiting and listening to what you have to show in your museum. So that's really great, because this has happened, of course, in many places around the world. And luckily, there usually are people like you that remember the story. So thank you for doing that.
Well, I do want to say, too, that in 1977, our historical society was formed, was envisioned. The dreamers were sitting around the kitchen table of Donald and Wilda Stewart's house. It had been relocated at the time of the Seaway to higher land at the north end of the Stewart farm. And they were sitting there and had this dream. And by October of 1977, they had a charter. One of the very first projects, in fact, I think it was the very first project, was to interview the elderly people. And we discovered just before the pandemic that these magnetic tapes were starting to deteriorate. So we've now digitized all those stories that were told by people. And they related to so many things about life in their old towns and what it was like at the time of the Seaway. So those are invaluable. They're just wonderful for
Absolutely.
for our historical society.
And
I wouldn't be a bit surprised that Margaret Markle was interviewed.
Yes, I think she was.
Sure.
But the other thing that I think, when you talk, we've been talking about history and what the villages were like, but one thing we also have to take into account is that at that time when people moved into new towns and they had to come together with 4 or 5 villages and different congregations and teachers from different schools and so on like that, that this was also one of the biggest community building processes that you would see, and that people pulled together. People came together as strangers from the different villages, and they made their communities work. And they put together a new version of the institutions they had, whether it was Women's Institute or the Masons or the churches or the schools and the business people in the shopping centers. They started to learn how to work together. And they then made these towns that were kind of almost an artificial town that was forced on them, and they made them real good communities.
Yep,
So,
sure.
I mean, that's a going forward kind of thing, but it's one of the things that I noted. And I became a community developer and a social worker working with groups of people and communities, I think as a result of me watching how people came together and worked together, and that you can create a really good quality of life out of kind of hardship and being forced together by force and being sad about the loss, but still going forward. That's pretty Canadian. That's pretty rural Ontario. I mean, that's just what people did.
Yep. And that's our story.
Yes.
Were there any other questions? Anybody wanted to unmute to ask Jim? Well, in that case, I wanted to thank you so much, Jim, for taking the time to prepare this presentation for us. It really was such a fascinating look at a part of Canadian history, and we are so grateful to have had you share it with us. I personally cannot wait to take the opportunity to visit the Lost Villages Museum and learn more about the story as well. So I might take you up on that offer of a tour.
You are welcome.
And we really hope that members of our audience take the time to visit and learn more as well.
Absolutely.
Finally, I want to take this opportunity to mention that the North Lanark Historical Society is getting ready to host our Apple Pie Fest and Classic Car Show at the North Lanark Regional Museum on Sunday, September 18th from 2 to 4 p.m. Tickets are on sale now and available for reservation by visiting our online store, stopping by the museum, or by giving me a call or sending me an email. So we hope to see you there. And thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.